Hi and welcome back to the Sword Studies series at the Academy of Historical Fencing. I'm Nick Thomas, and today we're going to look at this really quite beautiful British officer's sabre by Reed of Portsmouth. So, I've talked a number of times about these kinds of small stirrup-hilted sabres in the British sort of Napoleonic period, and they can't always be clearly defined as to who carried them and where. And by that I mean the service, not location, because this overall form, it follows the light cavalry sabre, but then does its own thing for fashion. And they were used by infantry officers, they were used by cavalry officers for dress wear, they were used by volunteer officers and yeomanry officers and naval officers, and it goes on. So even some line infantry officers did at times carry fancier stirrup-hilted sabres. And so it's really, really impossible to say who was using this sword. All we can say for definite is that it's Napoleonic era, British, and it's an officer's sword. It's ivory gripped, so it's or bone gripped, so it's very, very fancy. But what else can we say about this? Well, if I just get the scabbard off, be very, very careful. There we go. Getting out of the scabbard. So the leather and brass copper scabbard, very, very typical of infantry officers, but also used again by dress wear for cavalry, by militia and all sorts. Now the sword itself, it's of the wildly curved shamsheer type, so it is completely flat. It has a wild curve, it's quite short. Those are all typical characteristics of the shamsheer type. What is unusual is that it's unusually wide for a shamsheer type blade, has a really good shoulder on it as well. So this sabre, you can see it has a decent amount of blue and gilt left on it. It's sadly also taken quite a lot of edge damage. Now it would be easy to say that that's therefore been in battle. We can never say for certain where any of those came from. Those could have been done 200 years ago or more in battle. They could have been done by, kids of, in the 1950s, just bashing, found their father's uncle's swords and bashed them together. We just cannot say. Do not look at those markings and think this is a battle damaged sword. We don't know. And we're not likely to ever know. But this is an absolutely beautiful sword. What's clear on this sword is whoever specified it went for something very, very fancy. So not only is it bone gripped by the looks, or ivory gripped, but also the detail into the back strap, the langets especially, these kind of like leafed langets, all gilt. Very, very beautiful. So it's exceptionally fancy. And when you see British sabres that are exceptionally fancy with all the fancy detailing, they're often what we would call presentation swords. And presentation swords were usually given for great feats, for example, or sometimes for the officers and the troops in a regiment might get together and pay for a sword to be given to their colonel as a thank you. All these kinds of things. They could be given by the king. Presentation swords, as a rule, were given as a prize and therefore kept as a decoration, as an ornament, perhaps worn on parade, but not really as fighting swords. But that's what a presentation sword is. Is this a presentation sword? Well, I would say it's unclear. Is that it has some attributes of a presentation sword. Having massively, elaborately over-the-top langets, basically oversized and hugely detailed, and backstrap as well, those are characteristic features of a presentation sword. And yet, the guard is completely standard of a fighting sword, as is the grip, as is the blade. It doesn't have any markings to show that it's a presentation sword. The scabbard is completely typical of a service scabbard of its time. And so, if you had to ask me what this is, I actually suspect what this is a service sword, not presentation. It's just for somebody very wealthy and it's very fancy. So perhaps it's the service sword of maybe something like an admiral, or something like that. So the sword was made by Reed of Portsmouth, high quality maker, and Reed supplied a lot of swords to naval officers, unsurprisingly, being in Portsmouth, because, well, Portsmouth is a big naval dockyard and officers had to buy their own swords. So if you set up a high quality sword cutler where all the naval officers are, then there's a good chance that a naval officer is going to buy a sword like this. So it is elaborate and fancy and over the top, and yet Nothing about the fancy detailing that's been done to it compromises it as a weapon in any way whatsoever. The blade, yes, is that short, unfulled shamshir type, which I've always said is not really well suited to a general British fighting style. Absolutely doesn't mean it wasn't carried for that purpose, and as a close-in fighting weapon would be perfectly suitable. But this ornamentation, as much as it doesn't really compromise, it does add a bit of hilt weight. And so we are going to notice that the total weight of this, for its size, is going to be a little bit up. 802 grams. Now for a sabre that small, that is heavy because it's got so much hilt weight in it. And as a result, the balance is back at, let's have a look. 10 centimeters. Why is almost everything I ever measure balance-wise 10 centimeters? Clearly that's a thing. Now there is a much greater range of a spectrum of balance. It just so happens I keep measuring swords on this sword study series that come out at 10 centimeters. The blade length is 68 centimeters, which is 26 3/4 inches. So again, very short blade. The curvature is, as it looks, is wild. It's 10.5. Okay, so of all the swords I've handled, this is the most extreme. I've handled many at 10 centimeters. 10.5, it's actually the most extreme that I've seen yet. So what do we have here? Well, we have a sword that it is a bit silly in its blade, and yet lots of infantry, not just infantry, a lot of officer sabers did go down this line of outrageously silly shamshir type blades. And I will say, it's not a judgment on the Mamluk swords, the Egyptian swords, because the British versions of those swords tended to be a bit weird. Is that if you look at, say, Mamluk swords, they tend to be quite straight at the start and then they curve out in the way that Kilich's often do. The British, for some reason, ended up with curving immediately after the guard, and they end up with outrageous curves and curving way further back than the grip really is shaped for, which is why you sometimes end up with canted grips. So the British took on some influence from Egypt and used it in a strange way. So that doesn't mean that Mamluk swords were bad by any means. Mamluk swords were excellent. But the way that British ran with the influences was a bit strange. But anyway, they ended up with these very, very fashionable, what was sometimes called half-moon sabers. And they look cool as hell. And this particular example, I do think that this was a service sword. I just think it's somebody who is feeling rather plush and has the money to burn and bought something super fancy, or perhaps was bought for him. So there you go. That's the end of this video, and I believe the end of this set of swords from a friend that I had to get over. I had to rush through it quickly, which is why my pair of gloves are now absolutely filthy, because I've been handling swords that are being shipped on, and I'm not going to be cleaning up and do anything with myself. But it means that you got to see them, and I think that's the important thing, is that if I didn't rush through them, we wouldn't get these specifications, you wouldn't get to see them. So I hope you enjoyed seeing this series of 9 or 10 extra swords, and soon enough I will get back to going through my own personal collection, and especially some of the really nice things that I bought recently, which I know you're going to enjoy seeing. So that's it for that series for now. Thanks for watching. Please do subscribe if you haven't already.